One plane that I'm often asked about is a scrub plane. So I want to take just a few minutes to address some questions you might have about this tool. As discussed in the four-plane video, in the English tradition described by Joseph Moxon, there were three planes used for dressing rough-sawn lumber. These are the four-plane, the joiner plane, and the smoothing plane. In the English tradition, there was no plane that bore any resemblance to a scrub plane until Stanley introduced theirs in 1896. This was long after the invention and introduction of the other iron bench planes, and long after professionals started using machines to process rough-sawn lumber. But Stanley didn't invent the scrub plane. It's quite possible that the Stanley version was actually based on a continental European style plane. In German, this plane was called a Schrupabel, and that roughly translates to rough plane. One theory about the original intended use of such a plane is that in pre-industrial continental Europe, they had less access to sawn boards, and most of their lumber was riven or split out. If you've ever split out firewood, you know how split wood tends to start off a whole lot rougher and less flat than a sawn board. This would make a plane like a scrub plane a lot more useful to start with than the four plane used in the English tradition. Regardless of the scrub plane's origins, my own experiments and experience with the tool have led me to the conclusion that the scrub plane is not the best tool to flatten the first face of a sawn board. The longer and wider four plane or jack plane is a much better choice. If you compare the cambers and widths of the two planes, you can see why that is. The scrub plane has an extreme camber and extremely deep set iron. This iron is probably at least 1/8 of an inch cut that's capable of taking off. Whereas the four plane or jack plane, the camber is much less severe or much less pronounced. The iron is much wider and the depth of cut is a lot shallower. So this one isn't going to take such a deep scallop as the scrub plane is. The jack plane or four plane is also almost twice as long as the scrub plane. And in fact, in the traditional wooden plane, the jack plane or four plane could be up to 18 inches long compared to the 8 to 10 inch long scrub plane. So it was in fact about twice as long. As we discussed in the smoothing plane video, this makes a big difference. The longer sole of the four plane or the jack plane is going to do a much better job starting to flatten a board than the short sole of a scrub plane, which is going to tend to ride in and out of small hollows on the board. So when I'm flattening the first face of a rough sawn board with hand planes, I will typically start with the four plane or jack plane and then move on to the tri-plane. And my goal with those two planes is to remove as little material as necessary to bring the face of that board to flat. I don't want to overdo it. I just want to remove the material needed to get that board flat. After I've flattened the first face with the four plane and the tri-plane, and I flip to the second face, if I need to remove a significant amount of material from that second face to get to my final thickness, like 1/8 of an inch or more, that's when I will pull out the scrub plane. Because the scrub plane, while it is not so great at making a board flat, it can really remove a lot of material in a hurry. Just like when we were making our winding sticks and planing to a gauge line, when I'm planing the second face of a board after I've flattened the first face, I'm working to a marking gauge line. So it's easy for me to use the scrub plane and remove a lot of material quickly, but not do more harm than good because I can plane without going over that marking gauge line. But unless I have a lot of thickness to remove, the scrub plane stays on the shelf. So if you're new to hand planes, my recommendation for you is to skip the scrub plane for now. Learn to dress your rough sawn lumber in the English tradition, starting with the four plane and then switching to the tri-plane to do your final flattening. If, after learning and mastering the process of dressing rough sawn lumber with the four plane and tri-plane, you find yourself later in a situation where you need to remove more than 1/8 of an inch of thickness from the board, then consider experimenting with a scrub plane. However, a scrub plane should not be one of the first planes that you purchase or learn to use. Scrub planes are really a specialty tool for situations that you're not going to face with every sawn board.